In the frigid dawn of May 10, 1940, Wehrmacht Lieutenant Colonel Hermann Balck stood before his men of the 1st Rifle Regiment. The soldiers' eyes gleamed with an unnatural brightness, despite days without proper sleep. Their impending thrust through the Ardennes forest would require superhuman endurance, a challenge they would meet not through willpower alone, but with the aid of small white tablets distributed from medical kits. As Balck surveyed his troops, he witnessed the birth of a new kind of warfare, one fueled by chemistry as much as courage. "We marched and marched, day and night," one German soldier later wrote in his diary. "The pills kept us awake, alert, feeling invincible. We conquered fatigue as easily as we conquered nations." The white tablets were Pervitin, methamphetamine, distributed officially by the Nazi military leadership. This moment represents not merely a footnote in military history, but a profound transformation in how humans waged war. For the first time on such a massive scale, pharmacology became an intentional, systematic component of military strategy. The story of World War II cannot be fully understood without acknowledging the chemical courage that fueled its armies. The quest to enhance warrior performance through chemical means is ancient. From Andean coca leaves chewed by Incan messengers to run great distances, to the berserker rage of Norse warriors, possibly induced by bog myrtle or mushrooms, history records numerous attempts to transcend human limitations through substance use. Chinese warriors consumed ephedra-based preparations, mahuang, for millennia, while Zulu warriors utilized plant-based stimulants before battle. By the 19th century, these folk practices began intersecting with scientific advancement. The Napoleonic era saw military surgeons administer alcohol and primitive opiates to soldiers. During the American Civil War, morphine administration via the newly invented hypodermic needle became commonplace, while soldiers on both sides received whiskey rations before battle, a crude but effective method of reducing fear and pain. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870–71 marked the first documented use of cocaine as a military stimulant, with Bavarian soldiers utilizing the substance to enhance endurance on forced marches. However, these applications remained largely informal and inconsistent, lacking the systemic approach that would define World War II's pharmacological warfare. The late 19th and early 20th centuries witnessed unprecedented pharmaceutical innovation. The isolation of morphine, 1804, cocaine, 1860, and ephedrine, 1887, transformed ancient botanical knowledge into quantifiable chemical compounds. The synthesis of amphetamine in 1887 by Romanian chemist Lazar Edeleanu created a new class of powerful stimulants, though its psychoactive properties remained largely unexplored for decades. World War I served as a pharmacological testing ground. Cocaine saw limited deployment among French and German troops for endurance and pain management. Morphine became essential to battlefield medicine, while the war's unprecedented psychological traumas spurred development of new sedatives and psychiatric medications. The interwar period accelerated this pharmaceutical revolution. In 1919, Japanese chemist Akira Ogata synthesized methamphetamine, creating a more potent stimulant than its chemical predecessor. By 1934, the pharmaceutical company Temmler-Werke began marketing methamphetamine under the brand name Pervitin in Germany, promoting it as a remedy for depression and fatigue. In 1935, American chemist Gordon Alice synthesized Benzedrine, amphetamine, initially marketed as a nasal decongestant before its stimulant properties attracted wider attention. These developments coincided with the rise of scientific management and human efficiency studies, conceptual frameworks that viewed the human body increasingly as a machine to be optimized. By the late 1930s, military physicians in multiple nations began investigating stimulants' potential for enhancing soldier performance. The German military's Institute for General and Defense Physiology conducted extensive trials on Pervitin beginning in 1938, while British and American researchers explored Benzedrine's effects on alertness and fatigue resistance. This book examines how pharmaceuticals, particularly stimulants, shape the military strategies, tactical outcomes, and human experiences of World War II. The central thesis is threefold. First, the systematic administration of stimulants to combatants represented a fundamental shift in warfare, a deliberate pharmacological manipulation of human capability that altered military planning, execution, and outcomes. The German Blitzkrieg, British air defense during the Battle of Britain, and Japanese kamikaze operations all relied on chemically enhanced human performance. Second, this pharmacological dimension of warfare created a complex legacy of addiction, psychological trauma, and ethical questions that extended far beyond the conflict's official conclusion. The methamphetamine and amphetamine dependencies that began under military supervision transformed into civilian public health crises in post-war Germany, Japan, and to a lesser extent, the Allied nations. Third, the wartime experimentation with performance-enhancing drugs established precedents and research foundations that continue to influence military medicine, pharmaceutical development, and the ethical debates surrounding human enhancement today. Our examination spans the primary combatant nations: Germany, Britain, the United States, the Soviet Union, and Japan, comparing their approaches to pharmaceutical enhancement of troops. We will explore these drugs' effects at multiple levels, from high-command decision-making, particularly in the case of Hitler's increasingly erratic leadership under Dr. Morell's treatments, to the lived experiences of common soldiers receiving stimulant rations. The narrative will trace the arc from initial military application and apparent success to the devastating physical and psychological consequences that followed prolonged use. Through personal testimonies, military documents, pharmaceutical records, and medical studies, we will reconstruct the hidden chemical dimension of the most destructive conflict in human history. This is not merely a story of scientific curiosity or military expediency, but a profound moral reckoning. When nations systematically alter the biochemistry of those who serve them, what obligations follow? What price did individual soldiers pay for the pharmacological policies of their commanders? And what lessons does this chemical legacy offer for contemporary military ethics? In the chapters that follow, we will strip away the heroic mythology of the greatest generation to reveal a more complex reality. Armies of chemically altered men whose extraordinary achievements and terrible sufferings cannot be understood without acknowledging the substances that coursed through their bloodstreams as they made history. The pharmacological Third Reich, Temler-Werke, and the birth of Pervitin. In a modest laboratory in Berlin, Johannisthal, 1937, chemist Fritz Hauschild perfected a synthetic compound that would soon transform warfare. Working for the pharmaceutical company Temler-Werke, Hauschild refined a process for mass-producing methamphetamine, creating the drug that would be marketed under the brand name Pervitin. This development wasn't merely a pharmaceutical achievement. It represented the convergence of Nazi ideology, German industrial capability, and the emerging science of human performance enhancement. Temler-Werke, founded in 1917, had established itself as an innovative pharmaceutical manufacturer during the Weimar Republic. Under the Third Reich, the company aligned seamlessly with Nazi aspirations for German self-sufficiency and technological superiority. Dr. Theodor Temler, the company's founder, recognized the potential market for stimulants in a nation obsessed with efficiency and productivity. The company's leadership maintained close relationships with Nazi officials, positioning themselves as contributors to the regime's vision of a strengthened German people. Pervitin entered the civilian market in 1938 with extraordinary commercial success. Marketed as a remedy for depression and fatigue, advertisements proclaimed it an excellent means to elevate performance capability and a stimulant for everyone. The drug was available without prescription, sold in pharmacies throughout Germany in 3 mg tablets. Office workers, factory laborers, university students, and housewives consume the tablets to enhance productivity and alleviate exhaustion. Pervitin allows you to stay awake for 9 to 10 hours without feeling tired, hungry, or thirsty, declared one advertisement. The housewife who wears herself out during the day can accomplish her household tasks with the help of Pervitin in the evening and still have enough energy to go to the theater. Another campaign portrayed a smiling secretary with the tagline, "Work like never before with Pervitin." The drug quickly permeated German society. Chocolatier Hildebrand developed Hausfrau Schokolade, housewife's chocolate, containing 14 milligrams of methamphetamine per piece. while Pervitin-laced pralines became popular gifts. The Nazi regime, initially concerned about potential addiction, classified Pervitin under the Reich Opium Law in 1939, making it prescription only, though enforcement remained lax as physicians liberally prescribed the drug. Wehrmacht physician Otto Ranke recognized Pervitin's military potential after observing its effects on civilian performance. Ranke, director of the Institute for General and Defense Physiology at Berlin's Academy of Military Medicine, began systematic testing on military students in 1938. His findings confirmed that the drug dramatically increased alertness, reduced fatigue, and enhanced confidence, albeit with side effects including elevated heart rate, excessive sweating, and occasional disorientation. The essential benefit of Pervitin, Rankin noted in his reports, is that it can eliminate fatigue symptoms more or less completely. The psychological effects must be considered advantageous in most military applications. Feelings of depression vanish, self-confidence and concentration increase, and a subjective sense of efficiency and energy emerges. Ranke's early trials demonstrated that methamphetamine could keep soldiers awake and functional for up to 3 days and nights, a capability with obvious military applications. In late 1939, following the invasion of Poland, Ranke wrote to his superiors, "I view the widespread use of such pharmacological agents as a genuine perspective for military deployment." Temmler-Verke secured significant government contracts, modifying their production to create military-specific Pervitin formulations. The company developed tablets containing higher doses for combat operations and refined manufacturing processes to meet wartime demand. By early 1940, production lines operated continuously, with special military packaging developed for field distribution. The relationship between Temmler-Verke and the Nazi state exemplified the regime's integration of private industry into its militaristic ambitions. The company received preferential access to raw materials, tax benefits, and protection from foreign competition. In exchange, Temmler-Verke shared research data with military authorities and modified production according to Wehrmacht specifications. The scientific research supporting Pervitin's military application reflects the Third Reich's disturbing approach to human experimentation. While initial testing occurred on volunteers, later trials involved concentration camp prisoners, subjected to extreme sleep deprivation, while under Pervitin's influence. These experiments, largely undocumented in official military reports, represent one aspect of the ethical abomination underlying Nazi pharmacological research. By 1940, Temmler-Verke's development had transformed a pharmaceutical product into a weapon of war. The company had created not merely a drug, but a systematic method of enhancing human capability aligned with Nazi military objectives. As German forces prepared for the Western offensive, millions of Pervitin tablets moved from production facilities to frontline distribution centers, chemical courage ready to fuel the Blitzkrieg. Chemical Blitzkrieg, methamphetamine, and military strategy. At 5:35 a.m. on May 10, 1940, as German forces launched their offensive against France in the Low Countries, a chemical advantage coursed through their bloodstreams. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt's Army Group A, tasked with the seemingly impossible mission of moving 3 panzer divisions through the dense Ardennes forest, received special pharmaceutical support. Each soldier was issued 3 tablets of Pervitin with instructions to take one when fatigue set in and another after 4 hours if necessary. It was a bold violation of military logic, noted German officer Horst Müller, reflecting on the Ardennes thrust. "We accomplished in days what military textbooks said would take weeks. The men marched with a determination and alertness I had never witnessed before." The offensive required German forces to maintain constant movement through difficult terrain, while Allied forces deployed to meet them. Traditional military planning estimated such an advance would take at least 3 weeks. Instead, the German columns pushed through in just 4 days, their troops functioning without sleep for up to 72 hours at a time. French military intelligence, detecting the movement, dismissed reports as impossible. No army could move at such pace through the Ardennes. This implementation of methamphetamine in military strategy represented a fundamental innovation in warfare. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of Germany's panzer tactics, acknowledged the pharmacological dimension in his post-war writings. We advanced virtually without rest. The physical demands would have been impossible to meet without pharmaceutical assistance. The strategic advantage conferred by Pervitin manifested in three critical dimensions: speed, endurance, and psychological impact. The drug eliminated the natural limitations of human physiology: sleep, hunger, fatigue, that had constrained military operations throughout history. Tank commanders and drivers maintained focus through multiple day-night cycles, infantry covered unprecedented distances on foot, and supply personnel worked continuously to maintain logistics chains. Wehrmacht medical officers developed specific protocols for Pervitin distribution based on mission requirements. For standard operations, soldiers received 1 to 2 tablets per 24 hours. For special operations requiring extended wakefulness, doses increased to 2 to 3 tablets per 12 hours. Elite units, including Brandenburger Special Forces and Luftwaffe pilots, received higher allocations and specialized instructions for maximizing the drug's effects while managing side effects. A 1940 Wehrmacht medical document outlines the official instructions. In situations demanding exceptional performance, where sleep must be avoided for 24-48 hours, 3 tablets of Pervitin distributed over 24 hours will maintain alertness and combat readiness. A 4th tablet may be administered in extreme circumstances, but no more than 4 tablets per 24 hours should be consumed. The success of the French campaign, completed in just 6 weeks against all military expectations, cemented Pervitin's role in German military planning. The Luftwaffe became particularly dependent on the stimulant, with fighter pilots receiving special chocolate bars codenamed Flieger Schokolade, Flyer's chocolate, containing 20 milliliters of methamphetamine per piece. Bomber crews, facing long-duration missions over Britain, relied on Pervitin to maintain alertness during nocturnal operations. The Polish, French, and early Russian campaigns demonstrated how methamphetamine enabled a fundamental reconceptualization of operational tempo. German forces could advance beyond the expectations of defensive planners, maintain offensive operations through normal rest periods, and sustain psychological pressure on opposing forces. The drug aligned perfectly with the Blitzkrieg doctrine, an approach to warfare based on relentless momentum and psychological shock. Between April and December 1940, more than 35 million Pervitin tablets were shipped to the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe. Military medical reports from this period consistently praised the drug's contribution to operational success, while acknowledging emerging concerns about side effects and dependency. A July 1940 Medical Corps assessment notes, "The beneficial impact on combat operations is undeniable, though medical officers must monitor for cardiovascular complications and psychological disturbances with prolonged use." The 1941 invasion of the Soviet Union represented the apotheosis of pharmacologically enhanced warfare. Operation Barbarossa's ambitious timetable, conquering the Western Soviet Union before winter, demanded superhuman performance from German forces. The initial advance covered 350 miles in just 20 days, with panzer units frequently operating without rest for 48-72 hours. Medical records indicate that some frontline units consumed Pervitin at twice the recommended dosages during this period. Yet this chemical strategy contained the seeds of its own failure. By late 1941, medical reports documented widespread side effects throughout the German forces: cardiovascular problems, psychological instability, and declining effectiveness with repeated dosing. As one medical officer noted, "The tablet that enabled our victory in France is proving insufficient against the vastness of Russia." The correlation between methamphetamine use and tactical decision-making became increasingly apparent as the war progressed. German after-action reports show a pattern of initial operational brilliance followed by catastrophic errors in judgment, consistent with methamphetamine's effects of initial performance enhancement, followed by cognitive deterioration. Field commanders reported subordinates making irrational decisions during extended operations, while strategic planners consistently underestimated logistical requirements, a common cognitive error under stimulant influence. By 1943, as Germany shifted to defensive operations, military physicians had documented the diminishing returns of Pervitin use. A confidential medical directive from this period warns extended Pervitin use results in diminished efficacy and increased side effects. Battalion medical officers should strictly enforce dosage limitations and ensure adequate recovery periods between administrations. The implementation of methamphetamine in German military strategy represents a Faustian bargain, unprecedented short-term capability purchased at the cost of long-term sustainability. The drug enabled the tactical innovations that defined early Blitzkrieg success, but contributed to the strategic overreach and operational breakdown that followed. As one Wehrmacht physician observed in a 1944 report, "We conquered Europe with methamphetamine, but may lose the war through the same means." The Führer's personal pharmacy. Hitler under Dr. Morell's care. In a dimly lit room of the Reich Chancellery, an intimate medical ritual unfolded daily. Adolf Hitler, the man who commanded millions, extended his arm to receive injections from his personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell. This relationship between dictator and doctor evolved into one of history's most consequential medical dependencies, as Hitler gradually transformed from a theatrical abstainer into a chemical invalid sustained by a pharmacopoeia of over 90 medications. Theodor Morell's path to becoming Hitler's physician began unexpectedly. Born in 1886 to a primary school teacher, Morell studied medicine without particular distinction before establishing a practice in Berlin that catered to the entertainment industry. His reputation for discretion with sexually transmitted diseases attracted wealthy clients, including filmmaker Leni Riefenstahl, who introduced him to Hitler in 1936. When Morell successfully treated Hitler's severe stomach cramps and eczema, conditions other physicians had failed to resolve, the Führer declared, "No one has ever before freed me from my suffering. You are a genius doctor." Hitler's initial medical complaints reflected chronic digestive distress and fatigue, conditions possibly stemming from his strict vegetarian diet, psychological stress, and erratic work schedule. Morell's initial treatments emphasized natural remedies. Mutaflor, a preparation containing E. coli bacteria to restore intestinal flora, and vitamins administered by injection. These conservative approaches initially satisfied Hitler, who publicly espoused clean living and sobriety. "I have been Hitler's primary physician since 1936, Morell wrote in his medical diary, which survived the war. At first he allowed only natural treatments, maintaining his public image of abstention. This gradually changed as wartime pressures mounted. The transformation began subtly around 1939, when Morell introduced intravenous glucose injections to combat Hitler's fatigue. By 1941, amid the growing pressures of war, Morell's treatments expanded dramatically in scope and potency. The doctor maintained meticulous records of these administrations in a leather-bound journal, documenting a pharmaceutical regimen that grew increasingly exotic and potent. In 1941, Morell began administering Vitamultin, a vitamin preparation that contained methamphetamine. This introduction marked Hitler's first regular exposure to strong stimulants. The Führer's reaction was immediately positive. He praised his renewed energy and mental clarity. After a particularly effective injection before a meeting with Mussolini, Hitler awarded Morell the honorary title of professor and increased his official standing in the Nazi hierarchy. After the injection, the Führer appeared remarkably vital, Morell noted after that meeting. He spoke with exceptional fluency and conviction, dominating the conversation with the Duce entirely. By 1943, Hitler was receiving daily methamphetamine injections, often coupled with glucose and vitamins. These were supplemented with testosterone preparations, primarily testoviron, administered to address the dictator's declining libido and energy. The effects on Hitler's presentation were notable. Contemporary accounts describe his increasing tendency toward extended, rapid monologues and diminished capacity to process contradictory information, behavioral patterns consistent with stimulant abuse. Morell's pharmaceutical arsenal expanded further as the war's trajectory turned against Germany. In late 1943, following the first manifestations of hand tremors, Morell began administering a preparation called Eucodal, oxycodone, a potent opioid, to Hitler. This addition created a dangerous pharmacological cycle, methamphetamine, to elevate mood and energy, followed by opioids to manage the subsequent crash and anxiety. The Führer experiences relief from the Eukodal, Morel wrote in December 1943. His tremor diminishes markedly, and his mood improves within minutes of administration. He now requests this injection specifically by name. The July 20, 1944 assassination attempt accelerated Hitler's pharmaceutical dependency. Following injuries sustained in the bombing, Hitler experienced worsening tremors and declining health. Morel responded by increasing both the variety and dosage of medications. His records from this period document a staggering regimen: methamphetamine, vitamultin or Pervitin in the morning, oxycodone, Eukodal in the afternoon, sedatives including bromnervicite, bromide in the evening, with additional hormone preparations, glucose injections, and various pills throughout the day. Albert Speer, Hitler's architect and armaments minister, later reflected on the change he observed. From late 1943, I noticed that Hitler's ability to concentrate fluctuated wildly. He would shift between hyperactivity, speaking without pause for hours, and periods of profound lethargy, where he seemed unable to focus on essential matters. The pharmaceutical influence on Hitler's strategic decision-making became increasingly evident as the war progressed. Military historians note correlations between his medication schedule and his strategic directives. During periods of heavy stimulant use, Hitler frequently rejected withdrawal recommendations, ordered counterattacks with insufficient forces, and displayed magical thinking regarding Germany's military capabilities. The infamous no-retreat orders that contributed to catastrophic losses on the Eastern Front often followed documented administrations of methamphetamine. Wehrmacht General Heinz Guderian noted this pattern in his post-war memoirs. The Führer's intransigence increased notably from 1943 onward. Rational military arguments that he would have considered earlier were dismissed without consideration. His belief in victory, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, suggested a disconnect from reality that many of us found disturbing. By early 1945, as Allied forces advanced into Germany, Hitler's pharmaceutical regimen had rendered him physically debilitated, yet paradoxically energized, during amphetamine-induced periods of clarity. Eyewitnesses described a man physically stooped, with pronounced tremors, shuffling gait, and yellowing skin, who could nonetheless erupt into tirades of extraordinary duration and intensity, the pharmacological profile of a late-stage stimulant addict. Morel's final diary entries reveal increasing desperation. In April 1945, with Soviet forces approaching Berlin, the physician noted difficulty obtaining pharmaceutical supplies and Hitler's growing irritability during periods between injections. On April 21, 1945, 9 days before Hitler's suicide, the dictator dismissed Morel, suspecting him of attempting to administer sedatives to prepare him for capture. The relationship between Hitler and Morel represents more than a medical curiosity. It illustrates how pharmacology influenced leadership at the highest level of the Third Reich. The pattern of Hitler's drug regimen tracks closely with the trajectory of Germany's military fortunes. Initial success during periods of controlled stimulant use, followed by catastrophic failures as dependency and side effects accumulated. The ethical questions surrounding Morel's treatment remain profound. Was the physician merely responding to his patient's demands, or did he engage in deliberate manipulation of the dictator's biochemistry? Evidence suggests Morel understood the addictive properties of his treatments. His diaries contain references to withdrawal symptoms when medications were temporarily unavailable. Yet he continued and expanded the regimen, perhaps motivated by the power and privilege his position afforded him. The pharmacological management of Adolf Hitler represents one of history's most consequential doctor-patient relationships. From 1941 until Germany's collapse, the strategic direction of the Third Reich was determined by a leader whose neurochemistry was profoundly altered by a daily regimen of stimulants, opioids, hormones, and sedatives. This pharmaceutical dimension of Nazi leadership remains essential to understanding Hitler's increasingly erratic decision-making and Germany's ultimate military catastrophe. Through the needle's eye, Wehrmacht drug distribution and consequences. On the frozen Eastern Front in January 1942, a German soldier named Hans Weiser recorded his experience in a diary later recovered by Soviet forces. The temperature is 30 degrees C. We have not slept for 3 days. Everyone takes Pervitin. Eyes burn, fingers tremble. During the day we fight, at night we dig. Russian shells never stop. Without the pills, we would all collapse. This account captures the reality of daily life for millions of German soldiers who fought under the influence of methamphetamine, a systematic pharmaceutical enhancement program unprecedented in military history. The Wehrmacht's Pervitin distribution evolved from an ad hoc advantage into a comprehensive system that penetrated every level of German military operations. The distribution network operated with characteristic German efficiency. Pervitin moved from Temmler-Werke's production facilities to central military pharmacies, then to divisional medical units, and finally to battalion aid stations where tablets were allocated to frontline troops. Each soldier's Erste Hilfe Päckchen, first aid package, contained a specialized compartment for Pervitin tablets, typically holding 6 doses, enough for 3 days of combat operations. Military regulations established precise protocols for Pervitin distribution based on operational requirements. Standard infantry units received allocations calculated at 1-2 tablets per soldier per day during active operations. Elite units, including Brandenburger Commandos and Waffen-SS formations, received higher allotments, up to 4 tablets per soldier daily for special operations requiring extended wakefulness. A December 1941 Wehrmacht medical directive details these guidelines. For infantry engaged in sustained combat operations, daily Pervitin allocation should not exceed 2 tablets per 24 hours, except in extreme circumstances. For special operations units conducting infiltration or extended reconnaissance, allocation may increase to 4 tablets per 24 hours for periods not exceeding 48 hours. This formalized approach to stimulant distribution created a situation where entire units operated under methamphetamine's influence simultaneously, producing both tactical advantages and profound consequences. Company-level officers recorded enhanced capabilities during initial exposure. Soldiers marched longer distances without rest, maintained alertness during extended combat operations, and displayed elevated morale during difficult conditions. Wehrmacht records document remarkable performances under Pervitin's influence. During the 1940 Ardennes offensive, a single infantry battalion covered 60 kilometers in 24 hours without rest, an achievement medical officers explicitly attributed to methamphetamine. Luftwaffe reports note fighter pilots maintaining combat effectiveness during 14-hour missions following Pervitin administration. Tank crews operated continuously for up to 72 hours during breakthrough operations, stopping only to refuel vehicles. Yet these capabilities came at an enormous physiological and psychological cost. Medical records reveal the escalating side effects as usage continued, particularly on the Eastern Front, where combat operations extended for years rather than weeks. A confidential 1943 medical assessment acknowledges these consequences. Extended Pervitin usage results in deteriorating physical condition, cardiac irregularities, and psychological instability, including paranoia and hallucinations, in approximately 15% of regular users. Soldiers' testimonies provide vivid descriptions of these effects. Luftwaffe pilot Franz Weimann reported, "After the 3rd day using Pervitin, I began seeing streaks of light and hearing voices that weren't transmitted over radio. I could fly the aircraft, but increasingly felt disconnected from reality." Infantry Sergeant Gerhard Köhler described similar experiences. "We called them Pervitin phantoms, shadowy figures seen at the periphery of vision during extended combat operations. Most of us experienced them after 48 hours without sleep." The psychological consequences extended beyond hallucinations. Medical units reported increasing cases of extreme paranoia among long-term users, with soldiers sometimes firing on imagined infiltrators or becoming convinced that comrades were enemy agents. These episodes became common enough that frontline medical officers developed specific protocols for managing Pervitin psychosis, typically involving sedation and 48 hours of monitored sleep. Cardiovascular complications represented another significant concern. Military hospitals documented elevated rates of arrhythmia, hypertension, and cardiac arrest among units with high Pervitin consumption. A medical report from Army Group Center in 1943 noted cardiac incidents have increased 300% compared to pre-war baselines, with particular concentration among personnel with documented Pervitin exposure exceeding 200 tablets. Dependency became increasingly problematic as the war progressed. By 1943, military pharmacies reported unauthorized requisition attempts and theft of Pervitin supplies. Soldiers developed personalized methods for maximizing the drug's effects, crushing tablets for nasal insufflation, combining with alcohol, despite regulations prohibiting this mixture, and trading rations for additional doses. Medical officers noted withdrawal symptoms when supplies were interrupted, profound depression, suicidal ideation, and physical collapse. A Wehrmacht physician's report from 1944 observed, many soldiers now function adequately only when Pervitin is present in their system. Without it, they exhibit extreme fatigue, inability to maintain basic military functions, and psychological distress, including suicidal thoughts. This dependency represents a significant threat to combat readiness. The military leadership's response to these developments reflected a disturbing calculus. The immediate tactical advantages outweighed long-term health consequences. Rather than restricting Pervitin distribution as evidence of harm accumulated, the High Command merely adjusted protocols to manage side effects. Medical directives from 1943 or 44 emphasize recovery periods between stimulant cycles and rotation of heavily medicated units from frontline positions, treating the symptoms while maintaining the system. By 1944, as Germany shifted to defensive operations, Pervitin distribution became increasingly desperate and unregulated. With pharmaceutical production disrupted by Allied bombing, quality control deteriorated. Troops received inconsistent dosages, counterfeit preparations, and increasingly exotic combinations as military physicians attempted to manage dwindling supplies. Some units reported receiving methamphetamine tablets of such potency that several soldiers required hospitalization after standard dosing. The final phase of the war revealed the unsustainable nature of pharmacological warfare. As Wehrmacht forces retreated toward Germany, military medical services collapsed, leaving stimulant-dependent soldiers without either the drugs they relied upon or professional assistance with withdrawal. Medical records from this period document alarming rates of psychological breakdown, suicide, and desertion among formerly reliable units. The deferred cost of years of systematic methamphetamine distribution. Perhaps most disturbing were the experiences of teenage Hitler Youth members conscripted into military service during the war's final months. With minimal training but ample Pervitin supplies, these adolescents fought under continuous methamphetamine influence, their developing brains exposed to extreme stimulant effects while experiencing combat trauma. The few available studies of survivors indicate catastrophic long-term psychological consequences, including treatment-resistant psychosis and profound post-traumatic stress. The Wehrmacht's experience with Pervitin represents a stark historical warning about pharmacological enhancement in military contexts. The initial advantages, extended wakefulness, suppressed fear, enhanced confidence, created the illusion of superhuman capability. The subsequent collapse, addiction, psychosis, cardiovascular damage, revealed the biological reality that human physiology cannot be indefinitely manipulated without consequence. As one German military physician wrote in his post-war assessment, "We believed we had conquered the fundamental limitations of the human body. In reality, we had merely deferred payment on a biological debt that ultimately came due with devastating interest." The Benzedrine bombers, British and American stimulant programs. On the night of May 16, 1943, 19 modified Lancaster bombers of the Royal Air Force's 617 Squadron approached the German Ruhr Valley. Their mission, Operation Chastise, now immortalized as the Dambusters Raid, required extraordinary precision at extremely low altitude. The pilots had been awake for nearly 24 hours during preparation and would remain alert for another 8 hours of high-stress flying. In their flight jackets, alongside emergency rations and escape maps, each carried a small tube of Benzedrine tablets, their pharmaceutical insurance against fatigue. Flight Lieutenant David Shannon later recalled, "We called them wakey-wakey pills. You'd feel your concentration slipping after hours in the cockpit, pop a tablet, and 30 minutes later you'd be sharp again. Without them, I doubt we could have maintained the focus needed for such precision flying after so many hours without sleep. While Nazi Germany pioneered the systematic military application of stimulants, the Allied powers quickly developed their own programs based on amphetamine rather than methamphetamine. Benzedrine, amphetamine sulfate, first synthesized by American chemist Gordon Alice in 1929 and marketed by Smith, Klein and French from 1935, became the cornerstone of Allied pharmacological enhancement, a program that would eventually distribute over 72 million tablets to British forces and an estimated 250 million to American troops. The British military's relationship with Benzedrine began in 1939 when the Air Ministry commissioned research into fatigue countermeasures for Royal Air Force pilots. Initial trials conducted at Farnborough's Royal Aircraft Establishment demonstrated that Benzedrine significantly extended alert performance during flight simulator tests. Air Marshal Hugh Dowding, commander of RAF Fighter Command, took personal interest in these findings as the Battle of Britain loomed. By summer 1940, Benzedrine tablets became standard issue for RAF pilots, with official guidance recommending 10 milligallon doses when extended operations require alertness beyond normal human capacity. The RAF's Benzedrine protocols reflected a more measured approach than their Luftwaffe counterparts. While German pilots often received methamphetamine chocolate without specific limitations, British aircrews operated under stricter medical supervision. RAF flight surgeons maintained detailed records of Benzedrine distribution and monitored for adverse effects. Squadron medical officers had authority to restrict stimulant access for pilots showing signs of dependency or psychological disturbance. The official policy was clinical and controlled, noted RAF physician Andrew Zamoyski in a post-war interview. The reality in combat squadrons was more pragmatic. During periods of intense operations, most pilots used Benzedrine regularly. Medical oversight existed in theory more than practice when aircraft were needed in the air. Bomber Command became the heaviest institutional user of Benzedrine as strategic bombing campaigns intensified. Long-duration missions over Germany, often exceeding 8 hours of high-stress flying, created conditions where stimulant use became normalized. By 1943, medical surveys indicated that approximately 70% of bomber crews used Benzedrine regularly during operations, with higher percentages among Pathfinder units that required exceptional precision. The introduction of Benzedrine to British ground forces followed a different trajectory. Initial Army trials in 1940 produced ambivalent results. While the stimulant increased march endurance and delayed fatigue, medical officers noted concerning side effects, including elevated aggression and impaired judgment. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, however, recognized the tactical advantages and authorized expanded Benzedrine use during the North African campaign. By the Battle of El Alamein in October 1942, Benzedrine had become standard issue for British commando units and specialized infantry formations. The desert was where pills became part of the arsenal, recalled Lieutenant James Hastings of the 7th Armored Division. During the push at Alamein, our orders came with Benzedrine tablets, 2 before advancing, with strict instructions not to exceed 4 in 24 hours. The medical officers called it chemical courage. They weren't entirely wrong. American forces entered the pharmacological battlefield more gradually. The U.S. military initially approached stimulants with institutional skepticism, concerned about addiction potential and ethical implications. This changed dramatically after observing British experiences and conducting independent studies at military research facilities. By 1942, the U.S. Army formally approved Benzedrine for combat operations, beginning significant distribution during the Tunisia campaign. American military physicians established detailed protocols governing Benzedrine usage. The standard issue became 5 milliliters tablets, half the typical British dose, with recommendations not to exceed 10 milliliters within 24 hours. The U.S. Army's Technical Bulletin MED 77, issued in 1943, codified these guidelines. Benzedrine sulfate should be reserved for emergency situations where sleep is impossible, but performance must be maintained. It is not a substitute for proper rest cycles, and should not be used for more than 48 continuous hours. Despite these cautious official positions, actual usage patterns in combat zones often diverge from regulations. The intense demands of campaigns like the Normandy landings and Battle of the Bulge created conditions where stimulant use became routine rather than exceptional. Combat medics distributed Benzedrine liberally during extended operations, while individual soldiers developed unofficial methods for maximizing effects, including crushing tablets for nasal absorption or combining with caffeine from instant coffee. In the Ardennes, we stayed awake for nearly 4 days straight, remembered Sergeant Robert Kappa of the 101st Airborne Division. The temperature was below freezing. We were surrounded and reinforcements weren't coming. The medics handed out Benzedrine like candy. They called it courage in a tablet. I took 6 over 2 days. We were jittery and seeing things by the end, but we held the line. The U.S. Army Air Forces became particularly dependent on Benzedrine as bombing campaigns intensified. High-altitude daylight precision bombing, the cornerstone of American air strategy, required exceptional concentration during missions lasting 8 to 12 hours in unpressurized freezing conditions. Medical records indicate that by 1944, approximately 60% of U.S. AAF bomber crews used Benzedrine regularly during operations. Statistics reveal the staggering scale of Allied stimulant distribution. Between 1942 and 1945, British forces received approximately 72 million Benzedrine tablets, while American allocations reached an estimated 250 million tablets. Smith, Klein, and French operated production facilities at maximum capacity throughout this period, with military contracts receiving priority over civilian pharmaceutical needs. The Allied approach to stimulants differed from German protocols in several significant respects. While Wehrmacht physicians administered Pervitin to entire units simultaneously, creating formations of uniformly medicated soldiers, Anglo-American practice emphasized individual discretion within established guidelines. British and American troops typically received Benzedrine with instructions for self-administration based on personal assessment of fatigue levels, a more individualized approach reflecting Anglo-American military philosophies. Documentation of side effects and complications paralleled German experiences, though with important distinctions resulting from different pharmacological properties. Amphetamine, Benzedrine, produced less intense immediate effects than methamphetamine, Pervitin, but created similar patterns of dependency with extended use. Allied medical records document increasing reports of psychological disturbances as the war progressed, paranoia, hallucinations during extended operations, and significant depression during withdrawal periods. After using Benzedrine for 3 days straight during the Normandy breakout, I couldn't sleep for another 2 despite overwhelming fatigue, reported Lieutenant William Harrison of the 2nd Armored Division. When I finally crashed, I slept for nearly 20 hours and woke with the worst depression I've ever experienced. It took 3 days before I felt normal again. Cardiovascular complications emerged as a significant concern in both British and American medical assessments. Military hospitals reported elevated incidents of arrhythmia, hypertension, and in rare cases, cardiac arrest among personnel with documented heavy Benzedrine usage. A confidential U.S. Army medical report from 1944 acknowledged these risks while justifying continued distribution. While adverse cardiac events show statistical correlation with stimulant use, the operational advantages in critical combat situations outweigh these limited medical concerns. Perhaps most troubling were emerging patterns of dependency among combat veterans. By 1944, military police reports documented increasing incidents of Benzedrine theft from medical supplies, while field hospitals noted patients exhibiting withdrawal symptoms consistent with stimulant dependency. Post-war studies of veterans identified thousands of former servicemen with ongoing amphetamine dependencies that originated during military service, an unintended legacy of wartime pharmacological policies. Despite these concerning patterns, Allied military leadership maintained stimulant distribution through the war's conclusion. The final campaigns in Europe during 1945 saw Benzedrine usage reach its peak, particularly during the rapid advance into Germany, when Allied forces maintained continuous operations to prevent German forces from establishing defensive positions. During this period, Some frontline units reported Benzedrine consumption at double the recommended levels. The push into Germany was fueled by pills and determination, recalled Captain Thomas Wentworth of the British 11th Armored Division. We advanced for days with minimal rest, everyone functioning on Benzedrine and adrenaline. Only afterward did we recognize the physical toll this took. Several men in my company never really recovered their health. As with their German counterparts, Allied military physicians eventually acknowledged the unsustainable nature of pharmacological enhancement. A classified British medical assessment from April 1945 concluded extended Benzedrine usage creates diminishing returns in performance enhancement while generating increasing medical and psychological complications. Future military planning should consider stimulant usage a short-term tactical option rather than a sustained strategic approach. The Allied Benzedrine programs represented a more measured approach to military stimulant use than Nazi Germany's Pervitin distribution, with greater emphasis on medical oversight and individual discretion. Nevertheless, they reflected the same fundamental premise, that human physiological limitations could be overcome through pharmaceutical means to serve military objectives. The human cost of this approach, documented in thousands of cases of dependency, psychological trauma, and cardiovascular damage, remains a largely unacknowledged aspect of the greatest generation's wartime experience. Comrades and Chemicals, Soviet Stimulant Protocols. On the frigid morning of January 12, 1945, Soviet Colonel Fyodor Petrenko addressed his tank commanders before Operation Vistula Oder, the massive Red Army offensive that would carry Soviet forces from Poland to within 40 miles of Berlin in just 2 weeks. His pre-battle briefing included an unusual medical instruction. Each crew will receive special tablets. Take one before we move, another 12 hours later. They will keep you alert when fatigue tries to kill you. The special tablets were phenemin, the Soviet designation for amphetamine, distributed according to protocols developed during years of desperate combat on the Eastern Front. Unlike their Western allies or German adversaries, the Soviet Union entered World War II without established military stimulant programs. This changed rapidly as the existential struggle against Nazi Germany created unprecedented demands on Soviet troops. The Soviet Union's pharmaceutical industry, less developed than its Western counterparts in 1941, scrambled to establish domestic amphetamine production following the German invasion. Drawing on captured German medical supplies and scientific intelligence, Soviet chemists at the Zakusov Institute of Pharmacology in Moscow developed manufacturing processes for phenemine by late 1942. Production initially focused on aviation applications, with the first significant distributions going to Soviet Air Force, VVS pilots, defending the airspace over Stalingrad. The Germans had been flying on chemicals since 1939, noted Soviet aviation medical officer Grigory Lazarev in post-war interviews. We faced pilots who could operate for days without proper rest. Our own aviation medicine had to adapt or face defeat. Soviet stimulant distribution reflected the Red Army's centralized command structure and emphasis on collective rather than individual performance. Unlike Anglo-American protocols that provided guidelines for self-administration, Soviet phenemine distribution followed strict unit-level directives. Frontline commanders received precise instructions regarding when entire formations should receive stimulants, typically before major offensive operations or during critical defensive actions. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 marked the first large-scale implementation of Soviet stimulant protocols. Facing the final major German offensive on the Eastern Front, Soviet defenders received phenemine distributions coordinated with operational phases. Tank crews, who would face the greatest sustained pressure, operated under a regimented stimulant schedule. 1 5-ml tablet at the commencement of combat operations, a second tablet after 12 hours if fighting continued, with mandatory 24-hour rest periods after 36 hours of enhanced operations. Soviet medical records from this period document the performance effects observed. Tank crews maintained effective operation for up to 40 continuous hours. Artillery units sustained accurate fire despite extended combat, and infantry formations conducted counterattacks despite extreme fatigue. A Soviet medical assessment following the battle concluded Phenemin administration correlated with enhanced unit performance, particularly during the third day of operations when German forces began to exhibit combat degradation due to exhaustion. The Soviet pharmaceutical approach emphasized controlled administration and careful monitoring of side effects. Unlike Western armies where individual soldiers often controlled their stimulant usage, Red Army protocols required medical personnel to physically administer each dose and document reactions. This centralized approach generated extensive data regarding combat effectiveness and physiological responses, which informed subsequent refinements to Soviet stimulant protocols. By 1944, as the Red Army shifted to continuous offensive operations, phenemin distribution expanded dramatically. The massive Operation Bagration, which destroyed German Army Group Center in summer 1944, incorporated stimulant protocols at unprecedented scale. Soviet records indicate approximately 500,000 phenemin tablets distributed during this operation, concentrated among breakthrough units tasked with maintaining continuous advance without regular rest cycles. We moved for days without proper sleep, recalled Guards Tank Army Commander Pavel Rotmistrov. The pharmacists kept us fighting when our bodies demanded rest. It was necessary. The Germans had to be given no time to establish new defensive lines. Soviet military physicians developed specialized formulations for different combat requirements. Standard infantry received basic phenemin tablets, while reconnaissance units and special formations obtained higher dosage preparations. The most specialized formula, nicknamed tank chocolate, in a parallel to German traditions, combined amphetamine with analgesics and caffeine. Designed specifically for armored crews operating in the confined, physically demanding environment of T-34 tanks during extended operations. Unlike their German counterparts, who distributed Pervitin to virtually all combat troops, Soviet stimulant allocation followed strategic priorities. Elite Guards formations, breakthrough units, and specialized reconnaissance elements received priority for limited phenemin supplies. This targeted approach reflected both pharmaceutical production limitations and the Soviet High Command's emphasis on concentrating resources at decisive points. Soviet medical documentation acknowledged the same side effects observed by other armies while developing distinctive countermeasures. To manage the depression and exhaustion following stimulant use, Soviet medical units pioneered the controlled administration of sedatives during mandatory rest periods, creating a managed cycle of enhancement and recovery. Military pharmacists developed specialized sleep kits containing short-acting barbiturates that guaranteed rapid sleep when operational conditions permitted. The objective was maintaining consistent combat capability through pharmaceutical management, explained Colonel Dmitry Konstantinov, a Soviet military physician. Where German and American approaches accepted performance fluctuations, our protocols sought to engineer stable effectiveness through controlled cycles of stimulation and sedation. As Soviet forces advanced into Germany in 1945, phenemin distribution reached maximum intensity. The final offensives against Berlin incorporated stimulant protocols into operational planning, with assault units receiving enhanced allocations to maintain continuous pressure. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, commanding the 1st Belarusian Front during the Berlin operation, reportedly ordered, "The pharmacists must keep pace with the artillery. Both are essential to maintaining our offensive tempo." The Soviet experience with military stimulants exemplifies how pharmacological approaches reflected broader military doctrines and social structures. The emphasis on centralized control, collective rather than individual enhancement, and strategic targeting of resources characterized a distinctly Soviet approach to the same fundamental challenge faced by all combatants: transcending human physiological limitations in pursuit of military objectives. Chemical courage, Japanese military stimulants, and kamikaze operations. In the pre-dawn darkness of April 6, 1945, Lieutenant Yuji Nakamoto prepared for what he knew would be his final mission. As a pilot in the Japanese Navy's Special Attack Corps, known to Americans as kamikaze, he would deliberately crash his explosive-laden aircraft into an American warship off Okinawa. His pre-flight ritual included a military physician administering a significant dose of Philopon, Japanese military-grade methamphetamine, via injection, followed by the traditional cup of sake. The injection will ensure you remain focused and fearless until the moment of impact, the physician explained clinically. The emperor requires your absolute clarity for this final service. While Nazi Germany's methamphetamine program has received significant historical attention, Imperial Japan developed perhaps the most extensive military stimulant program of World War II. Japan's relationship with amphetamines preceded the conflict. In 1919, Japanese chemist Akira Ogata first synthesized crystallized methamphetamine, creating the foundation for what would become a national industry. By 1941, Japan had established the world's largest methamphetamine production infrastructure, with multiple pharmaceutical companies manufacturing military-grade stimulants under government contracts. The Japanese military stimulant program developed in distinct phases. Initial military applications began during the late 1930s in China, where Japanese forces conducting extended operations in difficult terrain received methamphetamine tablets to combat fatigue. By 1942, as Japan entered wider conflict in the Pacific, stimulant distribution expanded dramatically. The Imperial Japanese Army established formal protocols for methamphetamine administration, with specific dosage recommendations for different combat scenarios. Japanese amphetamine production reached extraordinary scale during the war years. Government records captured after Japan's surrender indicate annual methamphetamine production exceeded 400 million tablets by 1944, with approximately 70% allocated to military applications. Philopon became the primary military brand, manufactured to exacting specifications for combat distribution. Japanese military physicians developed specialized stimulant preparations for different service branches and mission requirements. Standard infantry formations received basic methamphetamine tablets, while naval special forces and aviation units obtained higher potency formulations. Elite units, including paratroopers and naval infantry, received access to injectable methamphetamine for operations requiring maximum performance enhancement. Our soldiers fought not only enemy forces but also jungle diseases, starvation, and exhaustion, explained Japanese military physician Dr. Susumu Nishimura in post-war interrogations. Philopon became essential to maintaining combat effectiveness under these conditions. We considered it a military technology comparable to any weapon. The most extreme application of Japanese military stimulants emerged during the desperate final phase of the Pacific War. As American forces advanced toward the Japanese home islands in 1944-45, imperial military leadership developed the kamikaze strategy, deliberate suicide attacks by aircraft against Allied naval vessels. This unprecedented tactic required pilots to maintain absolute focus during their final mission while overcoming natural survival instincts. Pharmacological preparation became an integral component of kamikaze operations. Special Attack Corps pilots received carefully calibrated methamphetamine doses before their final missions, administered under medical supervision. The standard protocol involved 5-10 milliliters of injectable methamphetamine approximately 1 hour before takeoff, often supplemented with traditional sake serving psychological rather than pharmacological purposes. Captured Japanese medical documents reveal the chilling rationale behind this practice. Philopon administration ensures pilots maintain optimal concentration during the extended flight to target areas while reducing natural anxiety regarding the mission's conclusion. The appropriate dosage enhances the pilot's technical performance, while supporting the psychological determination necessary for mission completion. The effects of this pharmacological preparation on kamikaze operations were significant. American naval reports noted the extraordinary precision of many kamikaze attacks, despite intensive anti-aircraft fire and challenging weather conditions. Pilots under methamphetamine influence demonstrated an uncanny ability to adjust their approach despite severe injuries or aircraft damage, a pharmacologically enhanced determination that increased their effectiveness as human weapons. Beyond specialized kamikaze applications, stimulant distribution throughout conventional Japanese forces increased dramatically during the war's final phase. As military situations deteriorated and supply lines failed, many Japanese garrisons relied on methamphetamine to maintain combat effectiveness despite starvation and disease. During the Battle of Iwo Jima, American forces discovered significant Philopon supplies among captured Japanese medical materials, with evidence of widespread distribution among the defending forces. Japanese stimulant protocols differed from Western practices in several notable aspects. While American and British forces emphasized individual discretion within medical guidelines, Japanese military culture imposed strict hierarchical control over stimulant distribution. Unit commanders and physicians determined exactly when and how soldiers received methamphetamine, often timing administration precisely to coincide with planned operations. The Japanese pharmaceutical approach also reflected cultural perspectives regarding endurance and self-sacrifice. Military documents describe stimulants not as temporary expedients, but as technologies enabling soldiers to fulfill their absolute duty to the emperor, despite physical limitations. This philosophical framing meant Japanese forces often used methamphetamine in more extreme ways than their Western counterparts, accepting greater long-term health consequences in service of immediate military objectives. American intelligence assessments during the conflict noted the pharmaceutical dimension of Japanese combat operations. A 1945 Office of Strategic Services report observed, Japanese units continue effective resistance despite conditions that would render normal troops combat ineffective. Evidence suggests systematic stimulant use contributes to this anomalous performance, particularly in isolated island garrisons, where supply and reinforcement have been impossible for extended periods. The consequences of Japan's military methamphetamine program extended far beyond the war's conclusion. Following Japan's surrender, approximately 50 tons of military methamphetamine stocks were released to the civilian market, creating widespread availability throughout post-war Japanese society. This massive influx of pharmaceutical-grade stimulants triggered Japan's first methamphetamine epidemic between 1945 and 1954, with an estimated 5% of the population developing dependency, an unprecedented public health crisis directly linked to wartime military pharmaceuticals. The pills that were supposed to help us win the war instead conquered us after peace arrived, reflected former Imperial Army officer Takashi Miyamoto in 1952, as Japanese authorities finally began restricting civilian methamphetamine access. They continued fighting long after the soldiers stopped. Japan's wartime stimulant program represents perhaps the most extreme example of pharmacological warfare during World War II, a systematic attempt to transcend human limitations through chemical means that ultimately created consequences extending far beyond the conflict's military conclusion. Comparative analysis. National approaches to pharmacological warfare. The major combatant nations of World War II converged on similar pharmaceutical solutions while implementing them through distinctly different systems, reflecting their broader military cultures and social structures. This pattern reveals how universal military challenges, human fatigue, fear, and physiological limitations encountered varied cultural, ethical, and strategic responses. Germany's approach embodied systematic efficiency with minimal ethical constraints, characteristic of the broader Nazi regime. The Wehrmacht integrated Pervitin into military planning as a technological force multiplier, calculating human biochemistry as simply another variable in operational equations. Distribution followed the German military's hierarchical structure while maintaining characteristic thoroughness, precise dosage recommendations, specialized formulations for different service branches, and detailed record-keeping tracking consumption patterns and effects. The chemical foundation of Blitzkrieg strategy represented the culmination of interwar German military thought, the logical extension of mechanized warfare where human components received the same technical optimization as vehicles and weapons. This approach achieved extraordinary short-term success while creating catastrophic long-term consequences, mirroring the trajectory of Germany's broader military experience. British forces implemented stimulants through their distinctive institutional pragmatism. The Royal Air Force pioneered Benzedrine use with scientific rigor, conducting extensive testing before implementation while maintaining medical oversight throughout the conflict. Royal Navy protocols emphasized careful performance monitoring, with ships' physicians maintaining detailed records of stimulant effects on watchstanding personnel. The British Army's approach evolved more informally, with frontline adaptation driving official policy rather than centralized directives. This pattern reflected traditional British military emphasis on professional judgment and adaptation to circumstances rather than rigid doctrinal adherence. The British approach to pharmaceuticals mirrored their broader war-fighting philosophy, observed military historian Richard Overy. They identified practical solutions, tested them empirically, and implemented them with professional flexibility rather than ideological commitment. American stimulant protocols revealed characteristic cultural contradictions. Official policies emphasized medical caution and individual restraint, with detailed guidelines restricting Benzedrine access and dosage. Yet actual field implementation often diverged significantly from these guidelines, with combat necessities driving pragmatic distribution that exceeded official limitations. This gap between formal doctrine and battlefield reality characterizes numerous aspects of American military experience. The pharmaceutical dimension of American operations expanded dramatically following the Normandy invasion, with stimulant distribution becoming increasingly normalized during the campaigns of 1944–45. This pattern parallels the broader American wartime experience. Initial caution evolving toward maximum material application as industrial capacity and operational momentum built toward the conflict's conclusion. Soviet stimulant distribution exemplified centralized control and strategic prioritization of scarce resources. Rather than universal distribution, Soviet protocols directed pharmaceutical enhancement toward specific breakthrough sectors and elite formations. The administration system maintained strict hierarchical control, with unit medical personnel physically administering each dose, rather than entrusting individual soldiers with self-regulation. This approach maximized impact while managing limited production capacity, a common pattern across Soviet wartime resource allocation. Perhaps most distinctively, Soviet protocols incorporated both stimulants and sedatives into a managed cycle designed to engineer consistent performance rather than creating dramatic but unsustainable enhancements. This pharmaceutical expression of dialectical thinking sought to resolve the contradiction between heightened performance and inevitable crash through controlled opposition, a characteristically Soviet approach to physiological management. Japanese stimulant protocols reflected the nation's military culture, emphasizing spiritual factors alongside material considerations. Military documents describe pharmaceuticals as tools enabling soldiers to fulfill spiritual obligations, despite physical limitations. Technologies supporting the Yamato Damashi, Japanese spirit, rather than mere performance enhancers. This philosophical framing enabled more extreme applications, including the systematic stimulant preparation of kamikaze pilots, perhaps the ultimate expression of pharmacologically enhanced sacrifice. Japanese distribution systems maintained strict hierarchical control while integrating stimulant administration into military ceremonies and rituals, blending modern pharmacology with traditional military culture. This synthesis characterizes broader patterns in Japanese military development, where Western technologies were adapted within distinctive cultural frameworks. Comparing the pharmacological approaches of major combatants reveals remarkable similarities in the substances employed alongside distinctive differences in implementation philosophies. All major powers converged on amphetamine-class stimulants as their primary solution, with methamphetamine dominating Axis programs and amphetamine featured in Allied protocols. This pharmaceutical convergence occurred despite limited scientific exchange during the conflict, demonstrating how military necessity drove parallel development paths. Dosage patterns reveal significant variations reflecting different risk calculations. German protocols accepted higher dosages and more aggressive distribution, with some Luftwaffe pilots receiving methamphetamine doses exceeding 20 millimoles daily during critical operations. Japanese approaches similarly embraced high-dosage applications, particularly for special operations and kamikaze missions. Allied protocols generally recommended lower doses, typically 5–10 milligrams of Benzedrine per 24 hours, reflecting greater institutional caution regarding side effects. The ethical framework surrounding stimulant use varied dramatically between combatants. Nazi Germany's approach reflected the regime's broader instrumentalization of human beings as tools of the state, with minimal consideration for long-term health consequences. Democratic powers maintained greater ethical tension regarding pharmaceutical manipulation, with military physicians documenting concerns even while implementing stimulant programs. This tension manifested in more cautious official protocols, even when field implementation diverged from these guidelines. The most significant differences emerged in how nations managed the inevitable consequences of stimulant use. German protocols largely ignored addiction and psychological consequences until they became severe enough to impact military effectiveness. Soviet approaches incorporated detailed management of withdrawal and recovery periods as integral aspects of their pharmaceutical strategy. Anglo-American systems emphasize medical monitoring while struggling to address dependency issues that emerged among veterans. These comparative patterns reveal how pharmacological warfare reflected not merely military necessity but deeper cultural and political structures. The chemicals employed were virtually identical, while the systems deploying them varied according to each nation's distinctive approach to warfare, human performance, and the relationship between individual and state. This pharmaceutical dimension of World War II represents more than a technological footnote. It constitutes a profound transformation in how modern states approach human performance in warfare. By systematically manipulating the biochemistry of their fighting forces, nations crossed a threshold in the relationship between military institutions and the bodies of their personnel. The substances have evolved in subsequent conflicts, but the fundamental premise established during World War II remains that human physiology represents a technical variable to be optimized through pharmaceutical means in service of military objectives. Beyond human limits, immediate combat performance effects. Private First Class Michael Donnelly of the U.S. 2nd Infantry Division huddled in a snow-covered foxhole near St. Vith, Belgium, in December 1944. For 3 days, his unit had repelled repeated German assaults during the Battle of the Bulge. Sleep had become a distant memory. When his platoon medic passed through distributing small white tablets, Donnelly swallowed his without question. 30 minutes later, the cold seemed less biting, my exhaustion vanished, and everything sharpened, he later recalled. When the Germans attacked again, I fired with a precision that seemed impossible after 72 hours without sleep. The pills kept us fighting when our bodies should have collapsed. This experience, replicated across countless battlefields, represents the immediate performance effects that made military stimulants so valuable to wartime commanders. The pharmacological impact manifested across multiple dimensions of combat performance, creating soldiers who temporarily transcended normal human limitations, with profound tactical consequences and eventual costs. The most immediate effect reported consistently across all armies was the dramatic suppression of fatigue. Soldiers who had reached the limits of endurance experienced renewed energy within 30-60 minutes of amphetamine administration. This restoration occurred without addressing the underlying sleep deficit or physical exhaustion, creating a pharmacological mask over biological necessity rather than resolving it. German medical records document infantry units maintaining effective combat operations for up to 72 hours with Pervitin support, while Allied reports show similar results with Benzedrine. Physical performance enhancements extended beyond basic wakefulness. Troops consistently reported increased marching capacity, with studies showing 20–30% improvements in distance covered before exhaustion. A 1941 Wehrmacht study measured this effect precisely. Infantry units receiving Pervitin marched an average of 55.7 kilometers over 24 hours, compared to 38.4 kilometers for unmedicated control groups. Similar British trials with Benzedrine showed Royal Marine Commandos maintaining effective march pace for 36 consecutive hours with stimulant support. Cognitive effects proved equally significant for combat operations. Military psychologists documented enhanced concentration, faster reaction times, and improved hand-eye coordination under amphetamine influence. These effects translated directly to combat skills: more accurate rifle fire, better aircraft control, and more effective artillery calculations. A classified 1943 Royal Air Force study found bomber crews showed 23% better target acquisition accuracy during simulator testing after Benzedrine administration. Perhaps most valuable from a military perspective were the psychological effects. Amphetamines generate pronounced confidence and reduced anxiety. Precisely the emotional states commanders seek to instill in troops entering combat. Soldiers under stimulant influence consistently reported diminished fear response and heightened aggression, creating a chemically induced version of what military training attempts to develop through months of preparation. The tablets made you feel invincible, recalled German paratrooper Kurt Gödde. During the Crete operation in 1941, we jumped into heavy fire that should have terrified us. Instead, we felt euphoric, almost joyful, as we engaged the British positions. Only afterward did the madness of our actions become apparent. These performance enhancements dramatically influenced tactical outcomes during critical operations. The German Blitzkrieg through the Ardennes in 1940 succeeded partly because armored columns maintained movement for 72 consecutive hours, a pace that caught French defenses unprepared and created strategic surprise. Luftwaffe bomber crews maintained effective operations during the Battle of Britain despite punishing rotation schedules. Allied bomber forces completed missions of extraordinary duration during the strategic bombing campaign, with crews remaining functional during 12-hour operations at high altitude in unpressurized aircraft. The pharmacological dimension proved particularly valuable for special operations requiring exceptional performance. German Brandenburger commandos operating behind Soviet lines maintained cover identities and completed sabotage missions despite extreme stress and sleep deprivation. British Special Operations executive personnel conducted operations in occupied Europe while maintaining alertness through multiple security checkpoints and high-stress encounters. American Ranger units performed extended reconnaissance missions that would have been physiologically impossible without stimulant support. Combat records reveal numerous instances where stimulant use directly influenced tactical outcomes. During the Battle of Britain, RAF fighter command pilots frequently flew 4 or 5 sorties daily, a rotation only sustainable through Benzedrine use. The defense of Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge saw American paratroopers maintaining effective perimeter defense despite 7 days of continuous combat, with medical records documenting systematic Benzedrine distribution throughout this period. The Soviet defense at Kursk featured artillery crews who maintained accurate fire despite 48 hours without proper rest, their performance sustained by phenomenon. Yet these remarkable enhancements came with immediate operational costs beyond long-term health consequences. The most significant was the inevitable crash following stimulant effects, a period of profound exhaustion and cognitive impairment as the body's deferred needs reasserted themselves. Military medical records document this pattern repeatedly. Units performing exceptionally under stimulant influence, followed by catastrophic performance collapse 48 to 72 hours later when the pharmacological support ended. This pattern created significant planning challenges. A 1944 American field report noted, units employing Benzedrine for extended operations must be rotated off the line immediately following mission completion. Performance degradation during the recovery period exceeds normal fatigue levels, rendering personnel combat ineffective for 24 to 48 hours following stimulant use. German forces experienced this effect dramatically during Operation Barbarossa. Panzer units that advanced extraordinarily during the initial 3 days subsequently suffered mechanical failures and tactical errors as crews entered stimulant withdrawal. Medical officers reported drivers falling asleep at controls despite extreme danger, while maintenance personnel made critical errors during crash periods. Similar patterns appeared among Allied forces during the Normandy campaign, where units that performed exceptionally during landing operations experienced disproportionate casualties during subsequent days as stimulant effects wore off. Another immediate operational consequence was impaired judgment regarding risk assessment. While reduced fear provided tactical advantages, it sometimes led to catastrophic decision-making, particularly among small unit leaders. Combat reports document numerous instances of squad and platoon leaders ordering tactically unsound assaults or failing to implement proper defensive measures due to stimulant-induced overconfidence. We called it Benzedrine bravery, when a normally prudent lieutenant would suddenly order an assault across open ground toward fortified positions, remembered British Sergeant Alan Thornton. You could almost time how recently they'd taken their tablets by how reckless their orders became. The operational impact extended to accuracy and fire discipline. While initial stimulant effects improved marksmanship, extended use led to deteriorating performance. Amphetamine-induced hand tremors became problematic for precision tasks after 24-36 hours of continuous use. Wehrmacht medical reports note declining rifle accuracy among snipers after the second day of Pervitin sustained operations, while RAF records document increasing navigational errors among bomber crews during extended Benzedrine-supported missions. Communications discipline similarly deteriorated under extended stimulant influence. Signal Corps officers reported increasing transmission errors and protocol violations after personnel had been awake beyond 36 hours, even with pharmaceutical support. A confidential 1944 U.S. Army evaluation noted, radio operators on Benzedrine for extended periods exhibit progressive degradation in transmission quality and security procedure adherence, creating significant operational security concerns after the second day of continuous operations. Perhaps most concerning from a command perspective were the psychological anomalies that emerged during extended stimulant-supported operations. By the third day of continuous amphetamine use, significant percentages of troops experienced perceptual distortions, paranoia, and occasionally hallucinations. These effects, documented across German, British, American, and Soviet forces, created unpredictable tactical behaviors that sometimes endangered unit cohesion. Wehrmacht reports from the Eastern Front describe sentries firing on non-existent infiltrators, vehicle crews responding to hallucinated threats, and infantry refusing orders due to stimulant-induced paranoia. Similar incidents appear in Allied records, with particular concentration during extended operations such as the Battle of the Bulge and Normandy breakout. These psychological effects rarely appeared in official after-action reports, but emerge consistently in medical records and personal accounts. The combat performance effects of military stimulants thus present a complex tactical equation. Extraordinary short-term enhancement traded against inevitable performance collapse, impaired judgment, and operational unpredictability. This pattern, immediate advantage purchased at the cost of subsequent vulnerability, mirrors the broader strategic challenges of pharmacological warfare. In the unforgiving calculus of combat, military leadership consistently chose immediate enhancement despite understanding the deferred costs. As one American battalion surgeon noted in a 1944 field report, the tactical benefits of maintaining an effective fighting force for 72 hours during critical operations outweigh the subsequent recovery requirements and medical concerns. In combat, tomorrow's problems yield priority to today's necessities. This pragmatic approach achieved immediate objectives while creating cascading consequences that would continue long after the tactical situations were resolved, a pattern that would extend beyond military outcomes to shape the lives of millions of veterans in the decades following the conflict. The biological debt, medical side effects, and addiction among troops. By January 1944, Luftwaffe physician Werner Beumelberg had examined over 300 pilots with similar symptoms: cardiovascular irregularities, extreme weight loss, persistent tremors, and profound psychological disturbances, including paranoia and hallucinatory episodes. His confidential report to the German Air Ministry contained a stark conclusion. We are witnessing the systematic pharmaceutical destruction of our most valuable personnel. The chemical courage that enabled our early successes is extracting costs that cannot be sustained. This assessment, echoed in medical reports across all major combatant forces, documents the biological debt incurred through military stimulant use. The enhancement of human performance through amphetamines created a constellation of medical consequences that manifested first among troops and later expanded into the civilian population. These effects range from immediate physiological disruptions to profound dependency patterns that transform temporary tactical advantage into permanent medical conditions. Cardiovascular complications emerged as the most immediately concerning medical consequence. Amphetamines dramatically increase heart rate, blood pressure, and vascular constriction, effects that became dangerous with extended use, particularly under combat conditions. Military medical records document alarming rates of arrhythmia, hypertensive episodes, and in extreme cases, myocardial infarction among personnel with heavy stimulant exposure. A confidential 1943 British medical assessment noted RAF personnel with documented Benzedrine usage exceeding 20 tablets monthly show 340% increased incidence of cardiac irregularities compared to matched controls. These manifestations particularly affect individuals with previously undiagnosed cardiovascular vulnerabilities. German medical records reveal similar patterns with greater severity due to methamphetamine's more potent cardiovascular effects. A study of Luftwaffe pilots conducted in 1944 found that 28% of those with regular Pervitin use developed clinically significant cardiac abnormalities within 6 months. These included persistent tachycardia, arrhythmia, and elevated blood pressure that remained even during non-medicated periods, indicating lasting cardiovascular changes. Neurological complications created equally significant medical challenges. Extended amphetamine use generates characteristic motor effects, including muscle tremors, coordination impairment, and, in severe cases, dyskinesia resembling Parkinson's disease. These manifestations prove particularly problematic for military personnel performing precision tasks: pilots, snipers, radio operators, and medical personnel. My hands developed a constant tremor that made instrument flying nearly impossible, reported Luftwaffe pilot Karl-Heinz Meyer. By 1944, I could only fly effectively with Pervitin in my system, yet the medication causing my tremor had become necessary to counteract its own side effects. This paradoxical dependency pattern became increasingly common as the war progressed. Medical records document personnel requiring amphetamines to maintain baseline function due to neurological adaptations caused by previous stimulant use. This phenomenon, termed functional dependency in military medical literature, created soldiers who became combat ineffective without pharmaceutical support. Nutritional deterioration accompanied extended stimulant use across all armies. Amphetamines dramatically suppress appetite while increasing metabolic rate, a combination that led to significant weight loss among regular users. Military physicians documented average weight decreases of 5 to 10 kilograms among personnel with heavy stimulant exposure over 3 months. This deterioration proved particularly dangerous during winter operations and among troops already facing ration limitations. Soviet medical records from 1944 note infantry units receiving regular phenamine distributions show average weight loss of 8 kilos per soldier over 4 months, with corresponding decreases in cold weather endurance and physical strength. This deterioration continues despite adequate ration distribution. Perhaps most concerning from both medical and operational perspectives was the psychological deterioration associated with extended stimulant use. Military psychiatrists documented a characteristic progression: initial performance enhancement followed by increasing irritability, paranoia, impulsivity, and, in severe cases, psychotic episodes featuring hallucinations and delusional thinking. After 6 weeks of regular Pervitin use, approximately 15% of personnel developed psychological abnormalities requiring medical intervention, noted a 1943 Wehrmacht psychiatric assessment. These manifestations occur at lower thresholds among individuals with previous psychiatric vulnerabilities, but emerge eventually even in soldiers with no prior psychological concerns. The progression from enhancement to impairment followed a similar trajectory across all forces, though timing varied based on dosage patterns and individual factors. Initial administration produced clearly beneficial effects: enhanced alertness, improved mood, increased confidence, and reduced fatigue. As usage continued, particularly when exceeding recommended guidelines, negative psychological effects emerged: irritability, emotional lability, exaggerated startle response, and paranoid ideation. With extended exposure, particularly during continuous combat operations with inadequate rest periods, significant percentages of troops experienced dramatic psychological deterioration. Military psychiatrists documented soldiers becoming uncharacteristically aggressive toward comrades, developing elaborate paranoid systems, experiencing visual and auditory hallucinations, and displaying behaviors resembling acute schizophrenia. German records contain particularly detailed documentation of these effects, as Wehrmacht psychiatrists conducted systematic studies of Pervitin-associated psychosis. Their findings identified a distinct syndrome they termed Pervitin psychose, characterized by paranoid delusions focused on perceived threats from comrades, tactical hallucinations involving enemy infiltration, and extreme emotional volatility cycling between euphoria and profound depression. The progression appears consistent across case studies, wrote Dr. Friedrich Panse, a German military psychiatrist. Subjects transition from tactical enhancement to psychological deterioration after approximately 200 millihours total methamphetamine exposure, with permanent psychological changes documented in approximately 6% of heavy users. Allied forces observed similar patterns. A classified 1944 U.S. Army medical report assessed Benzedrine-associated psychological complications. Approximately 10% of personnel receiving regular Benzedrine develop behavior abnormalities requiring removal from combat duties. Manifestations range from persistent anxiety and sleep architecture disruption to acute psychotic episodes requiring sedation and evacuation. Beyond these acute medical complications, the most significant long-term consequence was addiction, a pattern of physiological and psychological dependency that transformed temporary tactical enhancement into permanent medical condition. The addictive potential of amphetamines, recognized before the war by civilian medical authorities, manifested dramatically within military contexts, where controlled distribution created optimal conditions for dependency development. Military medical records document this progression with clinical precision. Initial occasional use for specific missions transitioned to regular consumption as tolerance developed, requiring increasing dosages to achieve the same effects. Personnel began experiencing withdrawal symptoms when stimulants were unavailable. Profound fatigue, depressed mood, excessive sleep, irritability, and in severe cases, suicidal ideation. As dependency deepened, soldiers developed characteristic behavioral patterns focused on securing adequate stimulant supplies. Medical records document unauthorized requisition attempts, theft from medical stores, trading of valuable items for additional tablets, and in extreme cases, self-infliction of conditions known to merit stimulant treatment. We began recognizing soldiers who were deliberately exposing themselves to sleep deprivation to justify additional Benzedrine allocation, reported Captain James Richardson, a U.S. Army physician. Some would volunteer for double sentry duty or consecutive missions, specifically to create conditions where stimulants would be medically indicated. By 1944, military medical authorities across all major forces had documented concerning rates of dependency. German assessments estimated that 10–15% of personnel receiving regular Pervitin developed clinically significant addiction requiring medical management. British studies suggested slightly lower rates of 8–12% among regular Benzedrine users, while American estimates ranged from 7–15% depending on combat intensity and deployment duration. These statistics represented millions of affected personnel, a massive iatrogenic health crisis largely unacknowledged in official military histories. The pharmacological enhancement that enabled extraordinary tactical performance had transformed significant percentages of the fighting force into chemically dependent individuals whose biological functioning had been permanently altered by military medical protocols. Military responses to this emerging crisis varied significantly between forces. German approaches focused on maintaining combat effectiveness rather than addressing dependency, with Wehrmacht medical directives emphasizing managed stimulant protocols that attempted to regulate dosing patterns while accepting underlying addiction as an operational necessity. Allied approaches demonstrated greater medical concern while facing the same tactical imperatives. British military psychiatrists developed protocols for rotating heavily medicated personnel from frontline service, while American Medical Corps established treatment programs at field hospitals for the most severely affected individuals. These efforts, while representing more humane approaches than Axis protocols, remained subordinated to operational necessities throughout the conflict. Perhaps most disturbing was the ethical contradiction inherent in military stimulant programs. The same medical officers responsible for maintaining troop health implemented and managed systems, creating widespread dependency. This contradiction generated significant professional discomfort documented in medical corps records across all forces. "We are systematically creating addiction while wearing the insignia of medical officers," wrote Major William Dennison, a British Royal Army Medical Corps psychiatrist, in a confidential 1944 assessment. The tactical necessity is undeniable, but the ethical compromise this represents to medical practice cannot be dismissed. This ethical tension remained unresolved throughout the conflict, as military necessity consistently overrode medical concerns. By 1945, as hostilities concluded, military medical services faced a profound challenge. Millions of returning veterans with stimulant dependencies created through official military protocols, a biological debt that would continue extracting costs long after the strategic calculations that incurred it had been concluded. The war that never ended, post-war addiction issues and veteran health. In August 1946, 15 months after Germany's surrender, Berlin police reported a disturbing pattern. Armed robberies targeting pharmacies had increased 400% compared to pre-war levels. The perpetrators displayed military efficiency and focused almost exclusively on securing amphetamine supplies rather than narcotic medications or cash. Investigation revealed that most were recently demobilized Wehrmacht veterans whose military-initiated Pervitin dependencies had followed them into civilian life. This pattern, replicated across all major combatant nations, represents the post-war consequences of military stimulant programs. The pharmacological approaches that enhanced combat performance created enduring health crises that extended decades beyond the conflict's conclusion, affecting millions of veterans and reshaping civilian pharmaceutical landscapes in ways military planners never anticipated. The immediate post-war period saw amphetamine dependencies transition from military to civilian contexts with minimal interruption. Veterans habituated to regular stimulant access suddenly faced termination of official supplies upon demobilization, creating immediate demand that manifested differently across societies. In defeated Axis nations, this demand fed black market networks dealing in diverted military supplies and pharmaceutical counterfeits. In victorious Allied nations, veterans often secured continued access through civilian medical systems unprepared to recognize or address military-initiated dependencies. Medical records from Veterans Administration hospitals in the United States document this pattern with particular clarity. A 1947 assessment of former Army Air Forces personnel noted approximately 15% of airmen with combat experience present symptoms consistent with stimulant dependency and report civilian continuation of patterns established during military service. Most have secured civilian prescriptions by reporting the same symptoms that merited military Benzedrine allocation. British medical authorities observed similar patterns, with Royal Air Force veterans showing particularly high rates of continued amphetamine use. A confidential 1948 Ministry of Health memorandum estimated that 12% of RAF combat veterans maintained regular amphetamine consumption through civilian channels, primarily by consulting multiple physicians to obtain prescriptions, without revealing the full extent of their use. The situation in defeated Axis nations proved more chaotic as formal medical systems collapsed alongside military infrastructure. In Germany, the dissolution of military medical services created an immediate crisis for stimulant-dependent veterans who had relied on Wehrmacht distribution systems. Criminal networks quickly emerged to meet this demand, with former military medical personnel sometimes operating illegal pharmaceutical operations using equipment and supplies salvaged from military facilities. Japanese post-war experience presents the most extreme example of military stimulant use, generating civilian consequences. Following surrender, Japanese military methamphetamine stocks, approximately 50 tons, were released to civilian markets with minimal restrictions. This massive influx of pharmaceutical-grade stimulants coincided with the return of stimulant-dependent veterans, creating conditions for the world's first major methamphetamine epidemic. Between 1945 and 1954, an estimated 5% of the Japanese population developed methamphetamine dependency, an unprecedented public health crisis directly linked to wartime military pharmacology. Japanese medical authorities documented over 550,000 chronic methamphetamine psychosis cases requiring hospitalization during this period, with veterans dramatically overrepresented in these statistics. The military seeds planted during the war bloomed into a civilian epidemic after peace arrived, observed Dr. Masaki Kato, a Japanese psychiatrist who treated addicted veterans. The same substance that enabled our soldiers to continue fighting, despite impossible conditions, became the enemy they couldn't defeat after returning home. Beyond addiction itself, veterans across all nations exhibited distinctive patterns of stimulant-associated health problems that persisted long after military service concluded. Cardiovascular complications proved particularly common and severe, with studies documenting elevated rates of hypertension, arrhythmia, cardiomyopathy, and premature coronary artery disease among veterans with significant wartime stimulant exposure. A 1952 Veterans Administration study found that former service members with documented heavy Benzedrine use during deployment showed 320% higher rates of cardiovascular disease compared to age-matched veterans without stimulant histories. This pattern was particularly pronounced among former aviators and special operations personnel who had received the highest stimulant allocations during service. Neurological consequences similarly persisted into civilian life. Veterans with extensive stimulant histories displayed characteristic patterns including persistent movement disorders, sleep architecture disruption, and accelerated cognitive decline compared to matched controls. A 1956 British follow-up study of former Royal Air Force personnel documented Parkinson-like symptoms among 15% of veterans with heavy wartime Benzedrine exposure, a rate approximately 7 times higher than age-matched civilian populations. Psychological consequences proved equally enduring and complex. Veterans with significant stimulant histories demonstrated elevated rates of anxiety disorders, treatment-resistant depression, and psychotic disorders that persisted decades after military service. These conditions frequently appeared intertwined with combat-related post-traumatic stress, creating complex clinical presentations that challenge conventional psychiatric approaches. We are treating veterans whose psychological injuries reflect both traumatic experience and pharmaceutical history, noted Dr. William Menninger, a leading American psychiatrist working with veterans. The stimulant legacy complicates the clinical picture significantly, creating patterns that don't respond to standard treatment approaches. Perhaps most concerning were the intergenerational consequences that emerged as veterans established families in civilian life. Medical studies documented elevated rates of congenital cardiovascular abnormalities among children born to veterans with heavy stimulant exposure, suggesting potential genetic or epigenetic effects from wartime pharmaceutical experiences that extended to subsequent generations. The response to these emerging health crises varied dramatically between nations, reflecting broader approaches to veteran welfare and public health. American and British systems gradually developed specialized treatment approaches for stimulant-affected veterans, though these programs remained underfunded and insufficient relative to need. Veterans Administration hospitals established dedicated treatment units for stimulant dependency by the early 1950s, while the British National Health Service incorporated amphetamine withdrawal protocols into veteran services. German and Japanese responses reflected these nations' distinctive post-war trajectories. West German authorities incorporated stimulant treatment into broader veterans' health services by the late 1950s, while East German programs emphasized rapid return to economic productivity with minimal acknowledgement of pharmaceutical legacies. Japanese public health authorities launched more comprehensive efforts in response to their dramatic civilian epidemic, establishing the world's first specialized methamphetamine treatment protocols by 1954. Despite these varied approaches, a common pattern emerged across all nations. The scale of stimulant-related health problems far exceeded available treatment resources, leaving many affected veterans without appropriate care. Medical systems designed to address conventional war injuries proved ill-equipped to manage the complex pharmacological legacies of chemical warfare directed at friendly forces. The most profound aspect of this post-war health crisis was its largely unacknowledged nature. Official histories minimized or omitted the pharmaceutical dimension of military operations, while veterans themselves often remained silent about stimulant experiences due to shame, stigma, or simple ignorance regarding the source of their health problems. This silence created a historical blind spot that has only recently begun receiving scholarly attention, revealing one of the war's most enduring and intimate legacies. "We came home with invisible chemical wounds alongside our physical ones," reflected former U.S. Army Air Forces navigator Thomas Richards in a 1980 interview. "The medals acknowledge the battles we fought against enemy forces. No one mentioned the chemical war that continued inside us long after peace was declared. Minds under siege, psychological impacts, and rehabilitation efforts." At the Veterans Neuropsychiatric Hospital in Philadelphia, 1952, Dr. Eleanor Hamilton documented a pattern she termed dual-origin combat syndrome, a complex presentation combining typical post-traumatic stress symptoms with distinctive features linked to wartime stimulant exposure. Affected veterans exhibited hypervigilance, exaggerated startle response, and intrusive combat memories, characteristic of what would later be termed PTSD, alongside amphetamine-specific features. Profound anhedonia, treatment-resistant depression, and distinctive cognitive patterns including rigid thinking and impaired emotional processing. These veterans are fighting two wars simultaneously, Dr. Hamilton noted, one against traumatic memories and another against the neurochemical alterations resulting from military pharmacology. Conventional treatment approaches address only half the battlefield. This clinical observation captures the profound psychological legacy of military stimulant programs, perhaps their most enduring and complex consequence. The interaction between combat trauma and pharmacological effects created distinctive psychological conditions that challenged conventional psychiatric approaches, and left many veterans struggling with conditions poorly understood by post-war medical authorities. The psychological impact manifested across multiple domains, with cognitive effects among the most immediately apparent. Veterans with significant stimulant histories demonstrated characteristic patterns including attention dysregulation, working memory impairment, and executive function deficits. These manifestations typically emerged during the immediate post-war period and often persisted for decades, creating significant functional impairment that complicated civilian reintegration. A 1950 Veterans Administration study documented these patterns with sobering statistics. Former servicemen with heavy Benzedrine exposure performed significantly worse on cognitive assessment batteries compared to matched controls without stimulant histories, with particularly pronounced deficits in sustained attention, cognitive flexibility, and impulse control. These limitations affected educational attainment, vocational stability, and interpersonal functioning, compromising the post-war opportunities military service was meant to enhance. Emotional regulation presented another domain of enduring impairment. Veterans with extensive stimulant histories displayed distinctive emotional patterns characterized by affective flattening, anhedonia, inability to experience pleasure, and emotional volatility, alternating between numbed detachment and episodes of explosive anger with minimal provocation. These presentations reflected the neurochemical alterations created by sustained amphetamine exposure, particularly depleted dopamine systems resulting from prolonged stimulant-induced release. Many returning servicemen describe feeling emotionally hollow or numb in civilian contexts, unable to experience normal pleasure or emotional connection, reported Dr. Frederick Lemire, a psychiatrist specializing in veteran care. This presentation differs significantly from standard combat fatigue and shows strong correlation with documented stimulant exposure during service. This emotional dampening created profound challenges for post-war reintegration, particularly affecting family relationships. Medical records from veterans counseling services document recurring patterns of emotional disconnection, with spouses reporting partners who seemed fundamentally changed from the individuals they had known before military service. While some of these changes reflected normal combat trauma, clinical assessments increasingly identified amphetamine-specific alterations that affected intimacy, parenting capacity, and basic emotional engagement. Perhaps most concerning were the elevated rates of suicidal behavior among veterans with significant stimulant histories. Follow-up studies conducted during the 1950s and 1960s documented suicide rates 340% higher among veterans with heavy wartime amphetamine exposure compared to age-matched controls without such histories. This pattern remained statistically significant even when controlling for combat intensity and diagnosed psychiatric conditions, suggesting a direct relationship between military stimulant use and subsequent suicidal behavior. These suicide statistics represent the most tragic manifestation of what psychiatrists eventually recognized as stimulant-induced mood disorders, conditions featuring treatment-resistant depression resulting from neurochemical alterations caused by extended amphetamine exposure. Veterans with these presentations typically experienced profound dysphoria unresponsive to conventional antidepressant treatments, creating therapeutic challenges that exceeded available psychiatric approaches. The interaction between stimulant history and combat trauma created particularly complex clinical presentations. Veterans experiencing what would now be diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder showed significantly different symptom patterns and treatment responses when they also had extensive stimulant exposure. Their presentations typically featured more severe emotional numbing, heightened physiological reactivity, treatment resistance, and distinctive cognitive distortions, creating what some clinicians termed pharmacologically modified combat trauma. Standard approaches for combat neurosis prove consistently less effective among veterans with significant stimulant histories, noted a 1956 Veterans Administration clinical bulletin. These cases require specialized protocols addressing both traumatic experiences and persistent neurochemical alterations resulting from military pharmaceutical exposure. Rehabilitation efforts for these complex conditions evolved gradually and unevenly across different national contexts. American approaches pioneered specialized dual diagnosis programs by the mid-1950s, combining trauma-focused therapy with emerging addiction treatment protocols. These integrated programs, initially developed at VA hospitals in California and Pennsylvania, represented early recognition that military stimulant legacies required distinctive treatment approaches. British rehabilitation efforts similarly evolved toward specialized protocols, though with greater emphasis on occupational rehabilitation alongside psychiatric treatment. The British Ministry of Labour established dedicated programs for veterans with complex adjustment difficulties, a classification that often included those with stimulant-related impairments. These programs emphasized structured vocational retraining with graduated expectations, accommodating the cognitive limitations many stimulant-affected veterans experienced. In Germany and Japan, rehabilitation efforts developed within different social and political contexts, but eventually converged on similar recognition of pharmacological legacies. West German programs initially focused on physical rehabilitation, while minimizing psychological dimensions, but gradually incorporated addiction treatment protocols by the late 1950s. Japanese approaches responded to their dramatic civilian methamphetamine epidemic by developing some of the world's first specialized stimulant recovery programs, expertise that subsequently benefited affected veterans. Despite these efforts, the majority of stimulant-affected veterans received inadequate treatment relative to their complex needs. Available programs typically reached only the most severely impaired individuals with obvious functional limitations, while many others struggled with subclinical impairments that nonetheless profoundly affected quality of life. The scale of need consistently exceeded available resources across all national contexts, creating treatment gaps that persisted for decades. Perhaps the most significant barrier to effective rehabilitation was the widespread failure to recognize the pharmacological dimension of veterans' difficulties. Military service records frequently omitted documentation of stimulant distribution, while veterans themselves often remained unaware of the relationships between their wartime pharmaceutical experiences and subsequent psychological challenges. This information gap created diagnostic confusion that compromised treatment effectiveness. and left many veterans misdiagnosed or inadequately treated. We're treating symptoms without addressing fundamental causes, observed Dr. Harris Isbell, a leading addiction specialist working with veterans. Many of these men don't connect their current difficulties with pills they received as part of normal military operations years ago. Without recognizing this pharmaceutical dimension, our treatments address consequences while ignoring origins. This disconnection between cause and consequence represents perhaps the most profound aspect of military stimulant legacies, the creation of psychological conditions whose origins remained obscured by military secrecy, medical compartmentalization, and cultural silence regarding pharmaceutical manipulation of troops. Countless veterans struggled with conditions directly resulting from military policies while never recognizing the source of their difficulties or accessing appropriate treatment. The psychological costs of military stimulant programs thus extended far beyond the tactical timeframes considered in wartime planning. The chemical courage that enabled extraordinary combat performance extracted decades of psychological suffering from those who served, an enduring tax on mental health that remained largely invisible in both official histories and public understanding of the war's human costs. As one anonymous veteran wrote in correspondence with Dr. Hamilton, "I left part of myself on the battlefield, as all soldiers do, but I lost another part in the aid station where they dispensed the pills that kept us fighting beyond human limits. The first loss makes sense to me, the expected cost of war. The second remains incomprehensible, an invisible wound from a chemical weapon aimed by my own side." From Pervitin to Provigil, Evolution of Military Pharmacology after WWII. In October 1961, a U.S. Air Force Strategic Air Command bomber crew completed a remarkable mission: 29 continuous hours airborne while maintaining combat readiness. Their aircraft carried nuclear weapons during a period of heightened Cold War tension. Unlike their World War II predecessors, these aviators didn't rely on Benzedrine. Instead, their flight surgeon had distributed a new pharmaceutical, Dexedrine, dextroamphetamine, representing the first major evolution in military performance enhancement since the 1940s. The pills were different, but the mission remained the same, noted Captain James Wilford, a SAC pilot from this era. Keep men functioning beyond normal human limitations to maintain strategic capabilities. The pharmaceutical specifics changed. The fundamental approach didn't. This continuity amid technological evolution characterizes the post-WWII development of military pharmacology, a progression that carried forward fundamental concepts from the wartime experience while incorporating new scientific understanding and addressing previous limitations. The stimulant programs that supported combat operations during World War II didn't end with the conflict's conclusion. They evolved into sophisticated pharmaceutical protocols that continue influencing modern military operations. The immediate post-war period saw a temporary reduction in military stimulant programs as forced demobilization decreased operational demands. This pause proved brief, as emerging Cold War tensions quickly created new requirements for extended military alertness. By the late 1940s, American and Soviet strategic forces had established pharmaceutical protocols supporting their nuclear deterrence missions, maintaining aircrew readiness during extended alert periods that often exceeded normal human endurance. The Korean War, 1950–1953, marked the first significant combat redeployment of military stimulants. American forces relied primarily on Benzedrine during early operations, essentially continuing World War II protocols. However, increasing recognition of side effects prompted military physicians to explore alternatives with more favorable profiles. By 1952, U.S. forces had begun transitioning to dextroamphetamine, Dexedrine, which offered reduced cardiovascular side effects while maintaining performance enhancement. Soviet forces followed similar pharmacological evolution, transitioning from phenomine to refined stimulant formulations during the 1950s. Declassified Soviet military medical documents reveal increasing sophistication in their approach, with specialized stimulant protocols developed for different service branches and mission requirements. Their submarine forces received particular pharmaceutical attention, with stimulant regimens designed to maintain crew performance during extended underwater deployments. The Vietnam conflict, 1955-1975, saw military stimulant use reach unprecedented scale within American forces. Department of Defense records indicate approximately 225 million Benzedrine tablets distributed to U.S. personnel during the conflict, exceeding even World War II quantities. Combat operations in Southeast Asia created conditions where pharmaceutical enhancement became normalized rather than exceptional, with stimulants routinely issued during extended missions. The pills were as much standard equipment as ammunition, recalled Lieutenant Robert Carmichael, who served with the 101st Airborne Division. Before long-range patrols, we'd collect our rations, extra water, ammunition, and Benzedrine. No one questioned it any more than they questioned bringing weapons. This period saw significant refinement in military understanding of stimulant effects and limitations. Air Force researchers conducted extensive studies regarding optimal dosing patterns, documenting the performance curve from enhancement through deterioration with unprecedented precision. These findings informed increasingly sophisticated protocols that attempted to maximize enhancement while minimizing side effects and dependency potential. The most significant pharmacological evolution emerged during the 1970s as military researchers explored alternatives to traditional amphetamines. This research, conducted primarily at Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, sought compounds offering cognitive enhancement, without the pronounced side effects and addiction potential of conventional stimulants. This research eventually identified promising candidates including pemeline, methylphenidate, and various amphetamine derivatives with modified release mechanisms. By the 1980s, military pharmacology had established nuanced protocols tailored to specific operational requirements. The U.S. Air Force developed distinct stimulant regimens for different aircraft types and mission profiles, while Special Operations Forces received specialized pharmaceutical packages supporting their unique operational patterns. These approaches reflected growing sophistication regarding the specific cognitive demands of different military functions, targeting enhancement more precisely than the broad stimulation of wartime amphetamine distribution. The most revolutionary development in military pharmacology emerged in 1988 when French researchers identified modafinil, a wakefulness-promoting agent with mechanisms distinct from traditional stimulants. Military researchers quickly recognized its potential for sustained operations, as it promoted alertness without the pronounced euphoria, jitteriness, and subsequent crash associated with amphetamines. By the mid-1990s, modafinil, marketed as Provigil, had entered experimental military protocols, representing the first fundamental shift in enhancement approach since World War II. The Gulf War, 1990-1991, represented something of a pharmaceutical bridge between traditional and emerging approaches. American and coalition forces primarily relied on established Benzedrine protocols, particularly for aviation operations. However, this conflict also featured initial field testing of newer compounds, including early deployment of modafinil among selected special operations units. Military after-action reports noted the comparative advantages of these newer compounds, accelerating their integration into standard protocols. By the conflicts in Afghanistan, 2001-2021, and Iraq, 2003-2011, military pharmacology had developed remarkably sophisticated approaches to performance enhancement. These operations saw the first large-scale implementation of modafinil alongside traditional stimulants, with different compounds deployed based on specific mission requirements. Air Force protocols authorized pilots to choose between Benzedrine and modafinil for fatigue management during extended missions, a level of pharmacological specificity unimaginable during World War II. We've moved beyond blunt instruments toward pharmaceutical precision, explained Colonel John Caldwell, an Air Force researcher specializing in aviator fatigue, where World War II physicians administered standard amphetamine doses regardless of mission specifics. Modern protocols match specific compounds and dosages to particular cognitive demands and operational contexts. This evolution extended beyond stimulants to encompass broader pharmacological management of combat performance. Modern military formularies include medications targeting specific operational limitations, beta blockers to reduce fine motor tremor for snipers and special operations forces, short-acting sleep medications enabling precise sleep management during complex operations, and anxiolytics reducing specific stress responses without broader sedation. Perhaps most significantly, contemporary military pharmacology incorporates sophisticated understanding of recovery requirements, addressing the fundamental limitation of World War II approaches that enhance performance without managing inevitable biological consequences. Modern protocols include pharmaceutical recovery periods, with medications supporting sleep architecture restoration, neurochemical rebalancing, and physiological normalization following enhancement. Recent conflicts have also featured increasing emphasis on pharmaceutical neuroprotection, compounds administered to mitigate cognitive damage from operational stressors, including sleep disruption, psychological trauma, and physical injury. This approach evolved directly from World War II experiences, documenting long-term neurological consequences of extended operations, representing perhaps the most significant conceptual evolution from wartime protocols that prioritized immediate performance over long-term health. Despite these significant advances, the fundamental dilemma identified during World War II remains unresolved. Human physiological limitations continue constraining military operations, creating pressure to transcend these limitations through pharmaceutical means. Modern compounds offer improved side effect profiles and reduced addiction potential, but still represent artificial manipulation of biological systems designed for different operating parameters. A classified 2010 DARPA Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency assessment acknowledged this persistent tension. Despite significant pharmacological advances, we continue facing the same fundamental challenge identified in 1940. Human cognitive and physical limitations represent the primary constraint on many critical military operations. Modern compounds offer more sophisticated approaches to this challenge, but the underlying biological reality remains unchanged. This recognition has driven increasing military interest in non-pharmaceutical enhancement approaches, including transcranial magnetic stimulation, targeted nutritional supplementation, and cognitive training regimens designed to maximize performance within natural parameters. These approaches represent attempts to address the limitations identified in pharmaceutical enhancement without introducing the side effects and dependency potential documented since World War II. Nevertheless, military pharmacology continues advancing along trajectories established during the global conflict that first implemented systematic stimulant use. Current research explores increasingly selective compounds targeting specific cognitive functions while minimizing collateral effects, the pharmacological equivalent of replacing carpet bombing with precision munitions. This evolution represents not abandonment of enhancement principles established during World War II, but their refinement through decades of advancing neuroscience and pharmaceutical development. The line connecting a Wehrmacht soldier receiving Pervitin before the invasion of France to a modern special operator using modafinil during a counter-terrorism mission remains direct, despite the sophisticated evolution between them. Military forces continue seeking chemical solutions to the enduring problem of human limitation, a search that began on an unprecedented scale during humanity's largest conflict, and continues shaping both military operations and individual service members' lives today.